Welcome back, folks, to another episode of the American Civil War. I'm Tony Stevenson, and we're doing a little kind of survey of the Civil War, seeing what we can see. And we are deep into 1863, the third year of the war. This is a scene from the Battle of Gettysburg, which, of course, was the biggest battle of the Civil War and the turning point of the Civil War, which was fought in July, the first part of July 1863. And we'll be talking about that on down the line. So let's kind of look at what we talked about last week. We kind of, we've been doing a lot of military history, and I told you all along that that was kind of the case with the Civil War. It is a lot of military history, but there was a lot more to the Civil War than just military history. And it's actually, the Civil War was almost like a revolution as well, in that there were just huge social, economic, and political changes that took place within the country during 1863. We looked at the growth of the Republican Party, which was a new party that came to dominate the national political scene for the next 70 years, while the Democratic Party kind of withered on the vine on the national level. They only elected two presidents in those 70 years. They were still very successful in local and state elections, and they still were a pretty important party to deal with. Of course, that would all change again with the Great Depression, where the Democrats would once again become one of the dominant parties of the country. We reviewed also how Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was kind of a revolutionary action, which freed the slaves in all or parts of the states that were in rebellion. Remember, it did not free all the slaves. It freed a majority of them, but it did not free them all. Only the states in the Confederacy or those states that still had parts of the states in rebellion had slaves free. And of course, that was kind of a moot point until we actually conquered the South. That would all change, of course, in 1865 with the advent of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. In relationship to that, we looked at specifically the case of William Carney, who was the first Black soldier to win the Medal of Honor because the Union started using Blacks in the Army to a great degree. There was over 200,000 freed slaves and freedmen, which actually joined the Army and fought on the side of the Union. So that was a big revolution in its own case. Of course, women were undergoing a revolution. The women's suffrage movement was really gaining steam, although it would take another 60 years before women would finally gain the right to vote on the national level. They gained it earlier than that in some states, but on the national level, it would take 60 years. We specifically looked at the case of Clara Barton, who was a very important part of this women's revolution going on because she kind of demonstrated how roles were reversing as a result of the Civil War. Up to this point, nursing had been predominantly a male occupation. We don't think that way, After that, after Clara Barton, it kind of became more of a women's role. Of course, now it's kind of gone back, where you see just about, I won't say 50-50, but there's a lot more men involved in nursing than there were there for a long time. We also looked at the role of the Democrats as dissenters. They were known as copperheads. And we kind of went through the theory about why they were called copperheads, as well as reviewing the economic state of both the Union and the Confederacy. So it's a tribute to the Congress in the Union that while the Civil War was going on, they had the foresight to plan for the future. Now, some of this occurred because they had been trying to do certain things, the Republicans had, and before them, the Whigs, that involved expansion to the West. But they were kind of blocked by the Southern Democrats because remember, there was this huge sectionalism going on prior to the Civil War. The South was scared for expansion to the West because they feared that there would be free states and that slaves would be excluded and thus they would lose their political power. The northern states, on the other hand, refused to expand unless it could be free states. So there was kind of a stalemate going on there. Well, after 1861, when the Civil War broke out and basically the South left the Union, the Republicans, who had a vast majority in the Congress, decided they were going to take action on some of these very important projects that involved expansion of the way into the West, that would put into law, make it into law, and you know as a result, we see three extremely important laws passed that had a tremendous impact upon the Western expansion of the United States. The first one was the Homestead Act of 1862. Now, there had been other Homestead Acts. This was not the first Homestead Act, but the other ones were they were kind of limited in scope. A lot of it was aimed towards veterans. My great grandfather, who fought in the War of 1812, was given a bounty deed for a homestead. And that's what he used when he moved west into the Ozarks in 1843. But it was kind of limited in scope exactly who could get a homestead, a bounty deed. Well, the Homestead Act of 1862 was much more wide uh, coverage as far as who could get it, had a tremendous impact upon the expansion into the West. Uh, First of all, it granted 160 acres of undeveloped federal land anywhere outside of the original 13 states that was still federal land, as long as anyone was willing to live on it and cultivate it for 5 years. The biggest difference was, believe it or not, it actually allowed for women and males over the age of 18 to actually homestead as well. So, it kind of expanded it. So women actually could homestead on their own. I'm not for sure how many did, but at least they were available to. It also allowed for persons who had served in the regular volunteer forces of the United States Army or Navy for at least 14 days during the existence of an actual war, domestic or foreign, where they could claim a bounty deed. So again, it covered the veterans. A lot of times, veterans weren't paid very much when they fought, and usually they only fought for 3 months up to the Civil War. 3 months was kind of the routine service, unless you join the army for kind of a long term thing. So the Homestead Act of 1862, folks, was just, I can't even begin to tell you how important it was. In the long run, there were over 160 million acres of land, mostly west of the Mississippi River, that were given away to 1.6 million homesteaders over the next 75 years. That, that's a lot of land, folks. And basically, all you had to do was go out and claim this land and live on it for 5 years and improve it, which, that meant, built something on it and try to farm it. Typical homesteader. I'm sure this is somewhere in the Great Plains. This is a sod house, which was very typical in the Great Plains. Uh, and this is very much, what you would have seen in a homestead in the latter part of the 1800s in America. Now, another big act that Congress passed that had a great uh, impact upon Western expansion was the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act basically established what became known as land grant colleges. And what happened was this: uh, Congress would grant the state 30,000 acres of land. And they said, it's up to you what you do with it. But the proceeds from that land has to be used to establish what were called land grant colleges. Now, the difference was these land grant colleges were designed to emphasize the agricultural and mechanical arts. What it meant to do was benefit farmers and working people, which had kind of previously been excluded from higher education. You know, you would not have found very many farmers who were able to send their children to university, even if they could have gotten in. Well, this all began to change because now you begin to see the establishment of these colleges that were specifically designed for to teach the agriculture and mechanical arts. As a result, a lot of them had the abbreviations A&M. So schools like Texas A&M, you know, et cetera. These schools became, land grant colleges. The first one was Kansas State University, uh, what is now Kansas State University. But by far and away, there were many others. Ohio State, of course, huge university, was a land grant college, as was the aforementioned Texas A&M. I didn't realize this. MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, was a land grant college. That kind of blew my mind because we think of MIT as being one of the greatest universities in the world today, and it is. And yet here it was originally was a land grant college designed to promote agricultural mechanical arts to the working class people. Cornell University, one of the Ivy Leagues. So it's it was a big deal, folks. Now there would be a second Morrill Act in 1890, and what this act did was it established colleges that were specifically designed for blacks. So you begin to see what are known as historically black colleges and universities begin to be formed, like Alabama A&M, Prairie View A&M, Lincoln University in Missouri, Tuskegee University in Alabama. These were all resultant from the second Morrill Act of 1890. Folks, I can't tell you what a huge impact this must have had upon people in the western states, particularly and in the Midwest for the most part, because all of a sudden people that could not go to college, and even if they could, they would want to go to college to gain some kind of working trade as such. They didn't want to go to college necessarily to study Shakespeare. Don't get me wrong, there's absolutely nothing wrong with Shakespeare. I'm just saying that they would go to college primarily to gain a working knowledge of something that would benefit them in the long run and help them perhaps start a business or whatever. So, Kansas State University, the first land grant college. I didn't know that, until I began to do some research on this. The third really important act, and this may have been the most important act of the whole bunch, was the Transcontinental Railroad Act. There had been efforts for the last 20 years before the Civil War to expand a railroad into the West, specifically a railroad that would cross all the way to the United States to the West Coast. Because remember, California is already a state. And so there was a great need to connect these two. But again, sectionalism just absolutely prevented it. Everybody knew it was needed. But the Democrats said, no, we're not going to fund it because it had to do with free states. The free states said, no, we're not going to fund it because the South is demanding that they be slave states. The result was nothing happened at all. So the Congress in 1862, now firmly in the hands of the Republican Party, passed the Pacific Railway Act, which authorized the construction of the first Continental Railroad. It would only take 7 years to build this railroad. Well, the first leg of it, let's put it that way. And again, if you happen to be with me and we did the American West, we spent a whole, session on building the Transcontinental Railroad. Just an absolutely important thing. The railroad, folks, I can't even begin to tell you how important it was to the expansion of the West, but it was just as important to the Civil War. I don't know if you know it or not, the Civil War is generally referred to as the first Railroad War. There was just a huge use of the railroad, particularly in the Union, to move troops around, to move supplies around. Remember, folks, when you got an army of 70,000 people moving, you had to feed those people, you had to clothe them, you had to, there was so much that had to be moved along with this army because they can only live so much off the land. And on top of that, the land got to the point where there wasn't much there to live off of, particularly in the South. So they had to use the railroads primarily as a supply line. And so that's why you will see a lot of the later Civil War campaigns following the railroad because they needed it for supplies. It also shouldn't surprise you that the railroads became a military target, particularly the Union against the South. Sherman, of course, when he did his March to the Sea, that we'll talk about in the next year, 1864, after he conquered Atlanta and moved to Charleston, South Carolina, pardon me, Savannah, Georgia. Uh, he absolutely, would just devastated the Confederate railroad lines after he would use them to get his supplies to his army as such. It was just a huge thing. Here's an example. This is a scene outside of Atlanta where Sherman's troops are digging up a railroad so the Confederates couldn't use it. This is what was called a beanstalk and cornstalk, pardon me, beanpole and cornstalk bridge. These things could be built in a matter of days. I can't even imagine running a railroad across one today. I mean, that must have been very scary if you were on a railroad going across one of those because they weren't built to be temporary, but they were darn close to being temporary. They were pretty tough. Okay, so as 1863 dawned, there was a glimmer of hope in the Union. When we finished 1862, we talk about how optimism was kind of down because people were tired of the war. Uh, Lives were being lost on an enormous scale. Uh, it was just, people felt like maybe we'd lost focus on what we were fighting the war for. It just, it was really, there was a lot of pessimism. But as 1863 began to emerge, things were beginning to kind of, you could almost see the, light at the end of the tunnel. You had to be aware that wasn't the steam locomotive coming at you, but there was beginning to be a glimmer of hope because they could almost sense an impending victory. I think the people that were in charge began to realize their advantage was their ability to manufacture goods and resupply their armies. The South was having a very difficult time with that. When they used something up, they necessarily could not resupply it. The ability to resupply their troops was beginning to really hurt. By the end of the war, folks, if you could walk as a male, you were pretty much being drafted. I mean, they were drafting kids, they were drafting old men. It was that sort of situation in the South. Out west, Grant was winning victories. Now, Grant's facing problems because he's gaining victories at enormous cost of life. And on top of that, as we'll see in a few minutes, some of the old rumors were starting to resurface about him, which made a lot of people second guess Grant. Buell and Rosecrans had actually had some success beating back Bragg's Heartland campaign. That kind of saved Kentucky and Tennessee for the Union. Out west, the Trans Mississippi West was basically lost to the Confederacy. So there was some things going on, particularly out west, that kind of gave the Union people a glimmer of hope. Back east, it wasn't quite as optimistic, but even there was a little bit of optimism. Antietam, which was a big battle fought before the end of the war, was not a real victory, but it was kind of being seen as a victory because Lee had been forced to leave the battlefield, which was something pretty much unusual for Lee up to this point. Burnside, of course, had been routed at Fredericksburg, as we talked about, but at least Lee could not pursue on back north, and he had to be kind of pushed back into southern Virginia because he tried to, his Antietam campaign had tried to basically invade Maryland to save it or bring it into the Confederacy, and that was lost. So there were some things going on back east. Both sides were just absolutely exhausted, folks, and really from January through April, there was almost no fighting going on in the Civil War, at least in the East. Out west, Grant was still doing some things. It wasn't, he wasn't quite kind of sitting around. He wasn't actually fighting battles as much as trying to prepare to fight a battle. And that would be the Vicksburg campaign, which would actually be fought the day after the victory at Gettysburg, or at least, the conclusion of it. Lincoln used a growing optimism, of course, to issue his presidential edict, the Emancipation Proclamation. So things are kind of beginning to maybe kind of look up. Now, we're going to spend the rest of the presentation here today talking about Grant and the Vicksburg campaign, because, folks, this is a huge campaign. It's side by side with Gettysburg as being the turning point in the Civil War. They occurred almost on the same day, not quite the same day, but pretty much, within the same week. Let's put it that way. Grant's success, and he had a lot of success out west, had won him all sorts of accolades. Lincoln loved him. Lincoln said, "Hey, this is the guy I want for my general." He said, "This guy will fight battles. He'll win victories." And even though there were some people out to get Grant, Lincoln was going to stand beside him. He said, "Hey, this is the man I need. I know he's got some faults. I know that there's a lot of people say things are not necessarily good. And I know he's using a lot of lies, but he's winning battles. He's winning victories. And that's what we need in order to get this thing over with." Now, the biggest problem with Grant was, I don't know if it's the biggest problem, but because really the problem really was jealousy. Let's just say it like it was. The military always has had a little bit of a problem with this. You gain promotions in the military by your success on the battlefield. When a war is going on, if you're successful, you can gain promotions pretty rapidly. If a war is not going on, it's pretty difficult to gain a promotion. Grant, remember, he started off as a very low-level officer, and by 3 years later, he's at the top of the heap practically. So you might imagine that some of his fellow commanders were not real happy about this. And so you begin to see a lot of political intrigue going on. And this was pretty widespread. Halleck was in the middle of it, but he was kind of being quiet about it. Buell and Rosecrans were not so quiet about it. Rosecrans is kind of a strange one, because Rosecrans himself had a drinking situation, and yet he was one of them, the big ones, that was accusing Grant of drinking. And remember, there's all sorts of rumors that broke out, particularly after the Battle of Shiloh, that Grant was drunk. That's why they weren't prepared when the South attacked them at Shiloh, and they had to rouse him up. And he was, went to the battlefield drunk. He was wobbly, when in all reality, what it was, he had hurt his leg. He could barely ride a horse, and he drove it. He rode it 20 miles to get there. I mean, so Grant, he was having enemies. They were coming out of the woodwork after him. It was so bad that Lincoln finally told the Secretary of War, Stanton, he said, "I want you to send somebody out there, and I want him to investigate this, and I want to know just exactly what's going on," because people were kind of leaving Grant. Even some of his strongest supporters in Congress were beginning to have doubts about whether or not Grant was the man that was really, going to lead this army to victory. And so Lincoln, told Secretary of War Stanton, he said, "Send a guy out here. I want this investigated clearly. I want to find out if what's being said, is it accurate or is it rumor?" Well, the guy went out there, and he spent several weeks with Grant investigating the situation, taking testimony from people. And what he wrote back to Stanton was this. This is his words. He said, "Grant was the most modest and honest man I ever knew. He wasn't a great man, except morally, not an original, brilliant man, but he's sincere, thoughtful, deep, and gifted with courage." He also said that he found very little evidence that there was any use of alcohol by Grant. Grant was an alcoholic, folks. That's just all there is to it. He could not hold his liquor. but by all accounts, he had pretty much overcome that problem. He had a few little binges during the Civil War. There's pretty much, that's a given. But he basically had it under control. Well, when Stanton's agent wrote back to Stanton and he went to President Lincoln said, "This is what I found." Lincoln said, "That's it. This is my man. I don't want to hear any more about this. This is it." And then I don't know if this story is true. There's a lot of debate about whether or not this story is actually truthful or not. But the story goes that Lincoln then asked Stanton, he said, "You know what kind of whiskey Grant prefers?" And he said, "Well, yeah, old Crow." And he said, "Fine, get a barrel of it, and I want a barrel sent to each one of my generals, because if this what it takes to make a general fight, then that's fine. Send the liquor to them." I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know that anybody knows it's true or not, but it's a great story, folks. This didn't end the rumors about Grant's alcoholism. As you probably know, Grant became president for 2 terms after the Civil War. Those things followed him. This is a cartoon from the second election, the second term in 1872 is when this would have been written. This was a cartoon that was drawn. It shows Grant wobbling down the sidewalk drunk, holding on to the light post that says second term. He's going to the theater, says theater every night, 3 acts, his royal nibs, which is basically an alcoholic. And then you got the doorman sitting there saying, "Oh, will he make it?" Well, I guess that's a police officer. Is he going to actually win re-election or not? So the story didn't die with the Civil War, but again, by all accounts and purposes, he had conquered his alcoholism for the most part. Unfortunately, he didn't conquer his ability to smoke cigars, and there's a good story behind that too. He didn't actually smoke very much until the war. And what happened was that somebody found out that he smoked an occasional cigar. People were so happy with his ability to fight wars that they were sending him cases of cigars. And I guess I've read, he said, "Well, I guess there's only one way to get rid of them, and that's smoke them." So he started smoking really heavily cigars from that point on. And of course, he ended up dying of throat cancer, if you don't know that. So Grant would spend most of the spring, late winter, early spring of 1863, trying to devise a plan to take Vicksburg. Vicksburg was the key to the West. Vicksburg, if you did not conquer Vicksburg, you were not going to have complete control of the West. Because as you see here, it sits right in the middle of the Mississippi River. You got it coming down this way, all the way to New Orleans. Remember, the Union had control of New Orleans already. But if you couldn't control Vicksburg, you couldn't get past it, because Vicksburg was called the Gibraltar of the West. I mean, it was so important to control of the Western campaign. Located on a 200-foot bluff overseeing a horseshoe bend in the Mississippi River. To get past Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, you had to basically go through a horseshoe bend. Sitting on top of this bluff were just unbelievable gun emplacements that the Confederacy had put up. So they could just absolutely blow any boat that they wanted to out of the water. On top of that, to the east on the land, it was hard to get to, because particularly to the north, it was bordered by swamps, the Yazoo swamps. And so really, folks, it was kind of an impenetrable fortress. That's what people thought. They thought, there's no way you can defeat Vicksburg, because it's just, you can't get to it. It was really a challenge. So Grant would spend about 4 months trying to figure out how to get rid of it, how to gain victory over Vicksburg. Halleck had told him, "This is what I want you to do," but I don't think he ever thought he was going to get it done. Grant launched several campaigns between January and June of 1863 to basically get to Vicksburg. Uh, I think there was 5 different ones. He tried everything. Okay, uh, he knew he needed to get to the high ground east of Vicksburg to be able to get to it, but getting there was quite the effort. The first thing he tried to do was have Sherman's troops boat through the Yazoo River bayous to the east, and that was an absolute disaster. Uh, I've not been in the Yazoo swamps, okay, the bayous, but I've seen pictures of it and all like this, and it's not the kind of place that most people would want to go. They said snakes and wildcats were dropping out of the trees onto the boats. Uh, Disease was just rampant. The spring rains came, and just there was no dry ground to get to camp. It was just an absolute disaster. So that didn't work. So then he thought, well, I'm going to build a canal across a kind of uh, peninsula of land, trying to bypass the guns of Vicksburg. But those failed. It was just an engineering impossibility to get them to do, because every time they would build one, it would inflood, and the result was it just that didn't work. Uh, they just they couldn't run the gauntlet, so because up to that point no one had figured out how to do it. Finally took him 5 months, but he finally figured out that the best way to get to Vicksburg, by all accounts, was probably the easiest. I'm not sure why he didn't try it. This is a picture of the Yazoo Bayou. This is a picture of what it looks like to the east and north of Vicksburg. Not one of the places you would probably want to go. Okay, let's put it that way. I'm not for sure there's a lot of people that would enjoy that type of land. Uh, what he finally ended up doing, he couldn't get through the land up here on the bayou, uh, and he tried to build a canal off this little peninsula, but that didn't work. And finally, he decided, well, the best way to do this is to just go around my land. I don't know why it took him so long to figure this out. I'm not going to second guess the guy, because I'm sure that there was reasons why it was difficult. But what he did was he marched his troops around through Arkansas, okay, and northern part of Louisiana, and brought them down here south of Vicksburg. Now, the problem was he had to get river boats down from Cairo and St. Louis to get the boats to cross over the land. Uh, the ones from New Orleans couldn't get there because of some problems going on with the Confederates that had kind of blockaded some of that land. And so what he had to do was he had to get boats around. Well, again, it was up to Commodore Farragut and Porter. And what they did, they figured out, as long as they stayed to the very edge of the river, that the guns could not get to them. They could shoot over them. And so what they did, they had to run them at night with no lights, and they just kept as close to the edge of the bank as they could. And for the most part, they were able to get the river boats by, uh, the gun emplacements, and get them down here, load the troops on, and cross over. But you can see it was May the 1st before this actually happened. Uh, so what happens was this. Grant has 40,000 troops. He got Sherman with him. Sherman is kind of the key to all this in the long run. And Sherman's army is also along with Grant's army. So they cross over the river, and they ferry across the river, and they have a little battle at Port Gibson. And then basically they head north towards Jackson, Mississippi, where Joe Johnston has a 15,000 man army. You can see here's Port Gibson, pardon me, and you see Sherman and Grant. He sent Sherman on ahead to fight some battles at Jackson against Joe Johnston's army. And this occurs on May the 14th, about 2 weeks after they cross over the Mississippi River. So he gets there and finds out that Jackson has basically evacuated Jackson, Mississippi. Johnson has. He's gone. He's left a little bit there, and they have to fight a little bit of a battle, but it's not very much. While he's there, Grant tells him to lay waste to Jackson. He says, I want you to get rid of Jackson. I want you to make sure that nobody can use it again during the war. This is the first instance that Sherman unleashes what becomes known as his concept of total war. When he's ordered to get rid of Jackson, he takes it absolutely literally. He gets rid of Jackson, Mississippi. He burns it to the ground. He demolishes everything he can. He gets rid of armories, shops, plants, train installation, railroad tracks. If there was a private house in his way, he got rid of that. I mean, he literally destroyed the city of Jackson, Mississippi. And this would become his kind of MO for the rest of the war. There's a reason that Sherman went down in history as the most hated man in the South during the Civil War. This is the reason right here. Now, to his benefit, it worked, folks. You can criticize him all day long, and people do, and they say, he unleashed this concept of total war because up to this point, it was not considered gentlemanly to do this. Sherman said, I don't care about being a gentleman. I want to win a victory. And so Sherman, uses this to his advantage. Well, with Jackson gone, they hit the railroad. That there's a railroad between Jackson and Vicksburg, and they get on the train. They have a train, and they absolutely, basically, go down to Vicksburg within a matter of days. Now, Vicksburg is under command of an army by a 30,000 man army by a man by the name of General Pemberton, who had been one of the generals that was involved back at the battles at those two forts. Boy, 78-year-old brain went bacon. The two forts that came before Shiloh. I'll think them here when I'm gone. Okay. By late May, Grant had surrounded Vicksburg, and after two failed assaults over 3 weeks, he realized he wasn't going to be able to just actually gain victory over Vicksburg. So he began a siege of it. And for the next 17 days, they absolutely pounded Vicksburg with guns, cannon. I mean, it was just unbelievable. Food became non-existent. Troops and citizens were forced to eat pets, to eat rats. They began to make makeshift caves. They would use caves in the bluff and live in them because it wasn't safe to live in the city. One citizen would later write that it resembled a scene out of Dante's Inferno. It was just living hell. And again, folks, this is one of those things about the Civil War that has gone down in history. A lot of people, hold Grant responsible for this, saying Grant, should not have done that. It wasn't the gentlemanly thing to do. And Grant, just like Sherman, said, hey, I was out for victory. I wanted to end the war. And the only way to end the war was to get rid of it, get rid of them. I can remember during the first Gulf War, the general in charge of the first Gulf War under President George Herbert Walker Bush. I remember he gave an interview, and somebody was questioning some of his tactics, whether or not he was being too harsh on the citizens of where he was invading over there on the Gulf War. And he said, I have orders to do two things: break things and kill people. He said, that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm a military man. I know it sounds terrible, but folks, that's what military is for. And there is a philosophy that the quicker you can end something like this, the faster, the less life you will have lost. Well, that's it. That's the way Grant and Sherman approached it. They said, we can't let these people, stay like this, because if they do, the war is going to linger on and it's going to cost more lives. So yes, it's going to cost lives in the short run. And yes, it's going to be living hell for the people that have to undergo it. But in the long run, it will save lives. And so here's a couple of pictures. This is one of these caves that people were living in on the on above the banks, on the bluff, above the river. This is one of the Confederate cannon overlooking the Mississippi River that they used to make sure that no boats could run the Mississippi River. So this is a good time to look at Sherman, and then we're going to stop for the day. Sherman would would become Grant's right-hand man now. After this, Sherman would be basically his protege. And, you know, Grant would eventually make him the leader of the army in the West, and really he would come on and be one of the major leader in the army of the East too. So Sherman just, you know, he became Grant's right hand man as a result of the battle and the siege of Vicksburg. Uh, Sherman was a very unusual man. Okay, he was born into a politically prominent family in Ohio. Graduated from West Point, served in the Seminole Wars, and then he kind of became a desk officer, uh, probably against his will, but he didn't really see much combat in the Mexican War. And by 1850, he had tired of the Army and actually retired from the Army, left the Army, became a banker, and then he became the head of what becomes known as Louisiana State University. He was the head of LSU for the years prior to the Civil War. When the Civil War broke out, he was a Union man, so he left, joined the Army, was sent east, and then he was finally given military command in Kentucky. That did not go well. If you read about Sherman's early first year in the Civil War, it was pretty much a disaster. He kind of had a nervous breakdown. Didn't, in fact, kind of have a nervous breakdown. He had a nervous breakdown. He had a mental breakdown. In fact, the case, he was forced to leave the Army for a few months. They actually, the newspaper articles, if you read them, they basically called him insane. You know, he wasn't insane, but you know, he probably suffering what we call today PTSD. Okay. Well, eventually he recovered and he got reassigned to Grant. Nobody thought that Sherman was going to be a big deal. Kind of like Grant, everybody thought that Sherman basically was just going to be a junior officer out there somewhere. Nobody really trusted him, I'll be honest, because just like Grant, he had this stigma of something wrong with him. You know, Grant was an alcoholic, Sherman was insane. And so they thought, you know, well, not much going there. It's not going to happen for him. Well, it did happen for him, folks. Sherman ended up being one of the best, and some people would argue he was the best general of the Civil War. Uh, you know, that's kind of subjective, but some people would argue that. I know this, he is generally labeled the first modern general because he used what's called maneuver warfare. Up to this point, generals kind of went at you head first. You know, you saw them coming. You know, not so Sherman. You never knew where the guy was going to be from one minute to the next. He did all sorts of weird maneuvers, feints. You never knew exactly what he was going to do. He also, of course, developed this concept of hard war, total war, where basically he would destroy anything in his path to make sure it could not be used against him at a later date. So Sherman becomes extremely important to Grant. Uh, I'll be honest, after reading what I've read about the Civil War, I'm not for sure the Union wins the Civil War without Sherman. Uh, Grant, of course, was a tremendous general, as was Lee, as was Andrew Jackson. Pardon me, Andrew Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. But I'm not for sure the Union wins the war without Sherman because he's the man that kind of wins the critical battle of 1864, which makes sure the Republicans stay in power. Because had he not won the Battle of Atlanta, I'm not for sure that the Republicans could have gained power. I'm not sure Lincoln would have been reelected. And if Lincoln wasn't reelected, if McClellan had won the presidency, I'm not for sure the Union would have won the Civil War. I think he would have probably called it off and let the South go their own way. So, you know, this guy is really important to the whole battle of the Civil War. Well, that's it for the day. Okay. I hope you've learned something. I hope that you've enjoyed what you've heard today. Uh, next week, we're going to look at what happens next, setting up the Battle of Gettysburg. We're going to look at the Battle of Chancellorsville. We're going to look at how Stonewall Jackson loses his life. I got Andrew Jackson on the brain today for some reason. Stonewall Jackson loses his life at Chancellorsville, which really is a big loss to the Confederacy. Uh, we will see how Meade gains control of the Union Army now in the East and basically fights the Battle of Gettysburg, which ends up being the biggest battle of the Civil War. I don't know that we'll get to Gettysburg next week. I think we will, but I'm not for sure. So I appreciate you being with me today. Keep that lifelong learning going. Keep that noggin working so you don't become a vegetable. Okay. I'll let you go. See you next
ya.
week.
Bye bye.